They didn't call me to apologize. They called me because the system was broken, and they didn't know why. My phone buzzed at 8:12 a.m. sharp, a number I recognized immediately. Not because I'd saved it, but because I'd deleted it twice before. Dale Prescott, the same CEO who'd smiled across the table in HR when he explained they were moving in a different direction, was now trying to book an urgent alignment call. I let it ring until voicemail. My name's Leonard Abrams. I'm 54. I spent 19 years building the compliance architecture for the company they now can't run. And they fired me without ever asking who owned the license that held it all together. I didn't argue when they let me go. Didn't even blink. I just watched Dale search for the right corporate buzzword to soften the fact that he was gutting his own safety net. He thought of me as a line item, redundant, disposable. They didn't understand that in my world, licensing, integration, vendor compliance words aren't just words. They're keys, locks, triggers. They missed the fact that the entire integration vendor agreement ran on a single clause I had personally drafted 6 years ago. Clause 4.7. The one they never even read. They wouldn't have known how. That's the thing about compliance. It's boring until it's catastrophic. It's not an app you can re-download. It's not a junior analyst you can overwork until they figure it out. It's a system, a legal framework, a promise in writing. And when you fire the guy who wrote the promise, you'd better hope you know how to keep it. Dale didn't. I can still see his face the morning HR scheduled my exit conversation. No subject line in the calendar invite. Just, room 3, A required. They didn't even have the decency to send it from his account. It came from a generic admin alias, like a note from a vending machine. Inside, Serena from HR sat perched on the edge of her seat, clutching the severance envelope like it might bite her. "Leonard," Dale began, eyes flicking between me and the wall behind me. "This is part of our strategic realignment. We've been evaluating efficiencies. Eficiencias. God, I love that word. It says so much by saying nothing. I remember watching him, calmly, watching the sweat bead at his hairline while he pretended this was painless for him. They wanted it quiet, clean. No one reviewed performance. No one audited active licenses. No one asked who had vendor of record status with our biggest integration partner. They just looked at a spreadsheet and decided I was expensive. I didn't protest. I didn't remind them that Clause 4.7 wasn't boilerplate, that it wasn't even public in their own documentation repository, that it was my failsafe. They never asked why it existed, because that would have required knowing what I actually did. I signed the severance paperwork without comment. The exit package was perfunctory. A polite, "Thank you for your service," one-time payout, legalese about non-disparagement. They handed me the envelope across the table like a bribe to be quiet. I took it, then I left, but not before glancing back once to watch Serena shift uncomfortably in her chair. She knew, or at least suspected. HR always knows. The truth is, I didn't hate them for doing it. I understood the math, cut the legacy fat, hired 2 cheaper project managers. Pocket the difference in this quarter's earnings call, but math only works when you know all the variables. They didn't. They forgot. I was the variable. Now, sitting in my apartment, I let Dale's voicemail spin itself out. "Leonard, hi, I realize this is short notice, but we're hoping you might have some time today to talk. We're seeing a few integration issues on our side. I think you're uniquely positioned to help us resolve this quickly. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Integration issues. I flipped open my personal folder, the one HR forgot I took with me. A single printout sat on top. Clause 4.7. Vendor integration compliance requirements. My signature at the bottom. Their lifeline. They didn't even know they'd deleted it, or that by removing me, they'd triggered the indemnity clause with our vendor. Vendor lockout was the polite term. I preferred the accurate one, system collapse. I closed the folder and set it down beside the severance envelope they'd so graciously provided. Funny thing about that envelope, they wrote my name on it like it meant they'd finished with me. They never understood that I don't sign anything I don't control. I took a slow breath and checked the time. 8:16 a.m. Another call came in. Same number. This time, I didn't even look at it. Silence is a language too. If you've ever been let go by someone who never asked what you actually did, who never understood how much they depended on you hit that subscribe button. It helps us share these stories with the people who know what real value looks like. I glanced once more at the folder. Clause 4.7 waiting like a loaded weapon I didn't have to fire. Not yet. I just had to wait for them to realize I wasn't coming back. The next voicemail would be even more desperate, and I was in no hurry to answer it. The second email didn't even bother with pleasantries. Subject line in all caps. Urgent. Integration issue. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I watched the blinking notification from my living room chair, tapping my thumb once against the folder on my lap. Clause 4.7 stared up at me. Black and white text, drafted in the driest legalese imaginable. It looked harmless. They'd never understood that was the point. Most companies think compliance is about liability. Cover your ass, fill in the forms, pay the invoice. But integration compliance is about risk transfer. It's about whose neck is on the line when something fails. 6 years ago, I spent a weekend rewriting our entire vendor contract because I didn't trust the boilerplate legal team had slapped together. I'd seen too many failures hidden in the fine print. I designed Clause 4.7 to be a failsafe, not a trap, just a line in the sand. This system depends on authorized integration oversight. Removing or replacing the authorized party without vendor approval nullifies indemnity. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even hidden. But no one read it. Not legal, not IT, and certainly not Dale. They called what they did realignment. I remember the HR meeting like an exercise in corporate theater. Serena from HR had tried for that sympathetic tone. Leonard, you've been instrumental here, but the leadership team believes it's time to modernize our approach. Modernize. Another perfect word that says nothing and hopes you're too polite to ask what it means. Dale watched me across the table, blinking like he was rehearsing being human. They handed me the severance envelope before I could even ask a question. But I didn't ask. I already knew the answer. They hadn't looked. They hadn't even thought to review active integration clauses or vendor compliance logs before deciding I was legacy fat. I didn't argue. Arguing would have meant they thought my role was negotiable. It wasn't. It was contractual. The second email they sent me this week had none of the soft language. Just panic. Leonard, please respond. Integration vendor has frozen access pending compliance confirmation. We need clarification immediately. Frozen access. That phrase was doing a lot of work. What it really meant was that their entire integration platform was locked behind vendor indemnity protocols. All those dashboards they sold to clients, offline. All the billing automations and partner data feeds, frozen. Because the indemnity transfer was revoked the moment they fired the named compliance authority. Me. I leaned back in my chair, reading the subject line again without opening the body. They'd figured out the surface-level problem, but they still didn't understand why it existed in the first place. Because they'd never asked. A memory floated up I hadn't thought about in months. That afternoon 3 years ago when legal tried to replace our integration vendor to save $80,000 a year, I'd sat in on that meeting silently, listening to a junior counsel read vendor C's out loud like they were a shopping list. Finally, I'd interrupted. Did you read Clause 4.7? Blank stares. I remember pushing the printed contract across the table, tapping the clause with one finger. It means if you replace me without approval, they don't have to cover any failures. And neither do we. The silence that followed was educational. For me, because I realized that day they'd never truly grasp what they'd signed. They didn't want to know. They just wanted it to work. They forgot compliance isn't magic. It's leverage. Now they were discovering exactly how much leverage they'd given up by cutting me loose. I finally picked up the envelope off my coffee table. The same envelope they'd pushed across that conference table at 9 a.m. on a Friday. The exit terms were simple. 1 month severance. Sign off on non-disparagement. Clean return of equipment. They forgot to include the one thing they actually needed. Knowledge. I turned the envelope over in my hands, reading the print like it was an inside joke. They thought it was the end of my obligation. It was actually the proof of theirs. Another Slack ping popped up on my old personal screen, the one they'd never fully decommissioned. Leonard, this is urgent. Please respond. I watched the green dot flicker on and off as someone in IT scrambled to figure out how they'd lost system admin rights. Vendor lock wasn't negotiable. They could fire me, but they couldn't replace me. Not without doing it right. And they hadn't done it right. My phone buzzed again. I let it vibrate itself quiet on the table. They still didn't get it. This wasn't a favor I could grant. It was a contract I had written to protect them. The only problem? They forgot protection can also mean exposure when you stop honoring it. I tapped clause 4.7 one more time with my index finger. A line I had drafted in a language they'd never bothered to learn. They'd learn now. Because by tomorrow morning, they'd realize no one was coming to save them. And I was in no rush to pick up. They don't realize the difference between silence and strategy. The third message in my inbox dropped at 7:42 a.m. Subject: follow up on urgent integration issue. They were trying to sound professional. You could hear the desperation seeping through the capitalization. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned to the old legal pad on my table, its yellow pages curling at the edges from years of drafts and notes. On the top sheet, scrawled in block letters, fail-safe, not trap. That was my own reminder, because I'd written clause 4.7 for them, not against them. People always think legal clauses are weapons. They forget they're also shields. Years ago, before I even joined this company, I watched a vendor integration meltdown bankrupt a mid-sized logistics firm. They'd outsourced everything. No oversight, no clause about indemnity if the vendor botched data migration, and the vendor did. Lost customs documentation, misdeclared shipments, millions in penalties, and not a single line in the contract to shift the liability back. I was working at a compliance consultancy then. I remember sitting across the table from their CFO's red, voice cracking as he read the line that sealed their fate. Company accepts sole liability for all integration errors. He didn't even know it was there. That moment stayed with me. When I joined our company and saw how they treated vendor contracts like throwaway PDFs, I refused to let that happen on my watch. Clause 4.7 was simple. Integration indemnity is contingent upon approved oversight by the authorized compliance authority. Any change in designation or removal of the authority nullifies indemnity. I didn't hide it. It wasn't fine print. It was bolded. I trained the legal team on it. I ran a brown bag lunch for operations explaining why we had to protect the company against vendor failure. I did my job, but you can't make people care about what they don't want to think about. They want shortcuts. They want cheap. They want to cut legacy cost centers. Now they were learning what those centers actually held up. The third email was shorter. Leonard, please, we're locked out. Vendor says no indemnity without your approval. This is urgent. I let the notification fade off screen. Funny how they didn't want my signature until they couldn't run the system without it. In my notebook, beneath the big block letters, I had another line written years ago in smaller handwriting. Not because they asked, because they didn't. They never asked why I wrote it that way. Why I insisted on the phrase, authorized compliance authority. Why I refused to let legal water it down. They called me difficult. They said I was overcomplicating things. One VP once told me in a meeting, Leonard, you're not a lawyer. Don't act like one. I didn't bother explaining that's exactly why I wrote it so the lawyers couldn't argue it later. Because when it fails, they don't call legal first. They call the person who knows how it breaks. Now that was me. I got up and walked over to the window, watching traffic crawl past in the morning haze. Somewhere in a glass tower downtown, Dale Prescott was probably pacing around a conference room, gesturing at an integration dashboard frozen on a vendor lockout error screen. Slack messages pinging like a fire alarm. Legal drafting contingency memos no one would read. Vendor account managers politely declining to waive indemnity because, contractually, we're unable to proceed without the named authority's approval. All because they wanted me off the payroll. They thought firing me was just a numbers game. They forgot compliance is numbers, but not the kind you budget for. I turned back to my coffee table. The severance envelope sat there, crumpled now from my fingers. They paid me to go away. They never paid to replace what I did, and I wasn't offering it back, because that clause was never designed to punish them. It was designed to protect them from themselves, from making the exact kind of mistake they had just made. I rested my hand on the legal pad, feeling the embossed company logo fading from years of use. I didn't set a trap. I wrote a failsafe. They triggered it when they fired the only person who cared enough to write it right. I scrolled through my inbox one last time. Re-urgent. 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 Each one more frantic than the last. I closed my laptop. Silence was a decision. If you've ever watched a company gut the very people who kept them safe because they couldn't see past the spreadsheet, drop a comment or share your own story, It matters. I sat back, let the quiet settle, because the real panic hadn't even started yet. Tomorrow they'd realize it wasn't just vendor lockout, it was reputation, and I planned to let them feel every second of it. They were still calling. I watched my phone buzz on the table, screen lighting up with the same number in sterile white font. No contact name saved. I had deleted it the same day they fired me. I didn't reach for it. Letting it ring out had become a small ritual now, a reminder that silence can be deliberate. My eyes drifted to the corner of my desk where the severance envelope sat propped against a stack of vendor contracts. It was creased at the top edge where Serena's fingers had gripped it too tightly in that small, overheated HR meeting room. Room 3A required. That was the entire subject line on the calendar invite. Professional, impersonal, just a location. No hint of what waited inside. I remember opening it that morning, noting the sender wasn't even Dale. It came from a generic admin alias, like a maintenance notice. They wanted it quiet, clean, sanitized. I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. I always did. It didn't feel any different at first. Same smell of coffee pods and printer toner. Same half-hearted corporate art on the walls. But inside the room, Serena from HR was sitting ramrod straight in one of those cheap mesh-back chairs they bought in bulk, clutching that envelope like it might fall apart if she let go. And Dale was there, of course, trying to look relaxed. He did that thing with his tie he always did when nervous, adjusting it too often, like symmetry would save him. "Leonard," he began, voice low and falsely sympathetic. "This is, well, I won't sugarcoat it. We're making some difficult strategic choices to realign resources more efficiently." Realign. Efficiently. I waited for him to finish assembling his corporate Mad Libs. Serena glanced at the table, eyes refusing to meet mine. I think she actually felt something, but she wouldn't say it. HR is trained not to. Dale went on about modernizing, future-proofing. He didn't mention vendor contracts, didn't mention licensing terms, didn't mention the fact that none of them had ever actually opened Clause 4.7 to see what it said, because they hadn't. They just decided I was expensive. Legacy. Replaceable. The envelope crossed the table like a peace offering. It even had my name on it in careful type. Almost ceremonial. I didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, I asked one question. A simple one. Who's replacing my integration authority? Dale blinked. For a moment, the mask slipped. He didn't have an answer. "Leonard," he finally exhaled. "We're not here to debate roles. This is finalized." He nodded at Serena. She pushed the envelope closer. I picked it up slowly, turned it over once in my hands, reading the crisp letterhead, the legalese. "We appreciate your service to the company. Your role is no longer required as part of this strategic transition. Please accept this severance package in exchange for your agreement not to disparage or discuss internal matters." Not to disparage, not to discuss. That was all they really wanted. Silence. They had no idea how expensive that silence could become. Serena's eyes flicked up then. Briefly, almost an apology. She knew, or at least, she suspected. HR always knows. They see the cracks before the executives even notice the foundation is crumbling. But their job isn't to fix it. It's to manage the exit. Dale cleared his throat. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" I thought about it. Clause 4,7. My signature at the bottom. The indemnity triggers they never reviewed. I could have explained it right there, given them one last free consultation. But why? They weren't listening then. They wouldn't have listened now. So I said nothing. I just nodded once, folded the envelope, and stood. Dale mumbled good luck in that reflexive corporate way that means nothing. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. No argument. No warning. No fireworks. They would learn about Clause 4.7 on their own time, and I wasn't going to be there to explain it. Now, months later, I watched that same envelope on my desk, creased, worn, a relic of their arrogance. My phone buzzed again. Same number, same silence when I let it die. Because I wasn't refusing to help them out of anger. I was refusing out of principle. They hadn't paid for understanding. They paid for silence. And I was giving them exactly what they bought. If you've ever sat in one of those strategic realignment meetings, wondering if they even knew what you really did, tell your story in the comments. We see you. I tapped the envelope once with my index finger, a small, final gesture, because next time they called, I'd let it ring even longer. They didn't know it yet, but the real cost hadn't even been tallied. and I planned to let them feel every cent. They'd sent 4 more emails overnight. Subject lines were starting to unravel. Follow-up. Need clarification. Critical. Integration vendor. Please advise. Their escalation was frantic but polite. That was the stage before outright panic. I left them unopened. Silence is so often mistaken for indecision. They didn't realize I'd made my decision the moment I walked out of their office with that envelope in hand. That last day, I didn't storm out. I didn't argue. I didn't slam a single door. But I was methodical. They watched me walk down the corridor with my employee badge clipped to my belt like any other day. Except it was my last. No one said anything in the hallway. A couple of nods, quick glances away. They all knew. News travels fast when someone with 19 years in compliance disappears from the org chart overnight. I paused at my cubicle just long enough to log in one last time. Not to take anything. Not to sabotage. To clean. I pulled up my access logs. Vendor portal credentials. Internal admin. Dashboard. Everything tied to my account. One by one, I revoked my own sessions. Clicked remove device on the company. Issued laptop. Terminated every auto login. The audit trail would show exactly what I'd done. And that was intentional. I wanted them to see it. People forget compliance isn't just about writing policies. It's about knowing what can be done and choosing not to do it. There was a moment, staring at the screen, where I wondered what it would look like to just leave it all live. Leave backdoors. Retain admin privileges. But that would have made me what they imagined I was. A threat. Number. I wasn't the threat. I was the safety mechanism. I deleted the saved passwords from the internal credential vault. Clicked the End Session button on the vendor integration portal. Confirmed. They never asked me to do that. Never thought to. Most people in compliance don't bother. They just walk out, knowing IT will eventually clean it up. But IT doesn't understand vendor indemnity triggers the way I did. I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting the integrity of my own work. Even then, especially then, I remember shutting the lid of the laptop slowly, pressing it down until the latch clicked. Symbolic. Final. My employee badge felt heavier in my hand than it ever had clipped to my belt. I turned it over once, reading the company logo. My name embossed in slightly faded silver. Leonard Abrams, Compliance Officer. I slipped it into the side pocket of my bag. They'd collect it later. I didn't rush. I didn't say goodbye. As I walked toward the elevator, I caught Serena's silhouette through the glass wall of HR. She wasn't looking at me, but I knew she knew. HR always knows. They'd given me that envelope like it was the closing of a door, like it made me irrelevant. But doors don't stay closed just because you lock them from one side. The elevator ride down was quiet. Too quiet. No music. Just the faint hum of old cables and the mechanical sigh of metal descending. I watched the floor numbers count down. Serzio. Arsher. Arshie. Arsher. L. When the doors opened, I walked out without looking back. They assumed they'd made a clean cut. That compliance could be reassigned, like an empty desk. What they didn't see was that the system they trusted me to build was never designed to run without me. It wasn't ego. It was fact. Clause 4.7 wasn't some petty signature move. It was the only thing keeping them from exposure if a vendor integration went sideways. Because the moment an unauthorized party tried to take over, indemnity vanished. Vendor liability stopped. All of it reverted back to them. And they fired the only person who understood that. I remember walking through the revolving door at the lobby. The security guard giving me the same nod he always did. He had no idea it was my last day. I kept walking, out into the chill of the city street. The envelope in my bag felt like a paperweight, not heavy because of the money, but because of what it meant. They had paid me to leave, and in doing so, they'd paid to lose the one person who knew how to keep them safe. Now, as my phone lit up with one more critical issue subject line, I let it vibrate itself to sleep, because I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't threatened them. I hadn't held them hostage. I'd simply removed myself from the equation. That was all it took. And tomorrow, they'd realize that cleaning up after me wasn't the problem. It was replacing me that was impossible. The first signs of failure weren't loud. That's the thing people never understand about systems. They don't blow up all at once. They crack. Quietly. My phone buzzed on the table, screen lighting up with a preview of their latest subject line. Critical. Vendor access issue escalation. Polite desesperación. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly what the body said, because I'd seen these messages before. Noted our company. At the logistics firm I watched fold years ago, because no one bothered reading a line in the contract that said, vendor indemnity void upon unauthorized integration access. Different wording, same meaning, same outcome. When I left my own company, I knew how this would begin. A single error message on their vendor dashboard. Red text, access denied. Authorized user, required. Most of them wouldn't even recognize it at first. They'd think it was an IT bug. I imagined the first Slack pings that Monday. Hey, anyone else getting an error on the integration screen? Weird. Can you screenshot? Forward to help desk. And help desk wouldn't know what to do, because no one ever taught them clause 4.7. I didn't teach them on purpose. It wasn't secrecy. It was relevance. They didn't need to know because they'd never be responsible for triggering it. Until they did. Vendor lockout isn't a malicious act. It's automated, programmed in legal code, not software. Once my designation was removed without formal vendor approval, indemnity was revoked. Instantly. No negotiation. No apology. The vendor isn't a villain in this story. They're protecting themselves. I drafted clause 4.7 so no one on our side could ever say, we didn't know. But of course they never read it. The first email they sent me after I left was polite. Hi Leonard, hope you're well. We're running into a small integration issue. Are you available for a quick consult? A small integration issue. That phrasing made me laugh. Small? Like a hairline fracture in a dam. I remember deleting it without responding. Not because I was angry, but because they hadn't even tried to understand the problem. They didn't want help. They wanted a band-aid. They didn't get one. After that first email went unanswered, they tried to solve it internally. I could imagine it in detail. Slack threads piling up. IT looped in. Legal looped in. Operations pinged. None of them had the authority to fix it, because that authority was gone. Vendor policy was clear. I wrote it with their legal team years ago. Integration indemnity is contingent upon approved oversight by the named compliance authority. Named me. They wanted to cut me out to save a salary line. They didn't realize they were buying back millions in risk. Vendor didn't budge, because vendor indemnity isn't goodwill. It's legal exposure. One Slack message I heard about secondhand was apparently a classic. Who even wrote this clause? I did. On purpose. Because I'd seen what happens when you don't. Not just at the logistics firm years back, but at another SaaS company I consulted for briefly, where the vendor crash lost them two of their biggest clients in a single week. I remembered the CFO there, voice cracking in the boardroom. We thought they'd just fix it. They didn't. They couldn't. So when I drafted clause 4.7, I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I was trying to make sure no one in our company ever had to have that meeting. That's what they fired. Not just me, but the one person who understood the cost of ignoring the line between cost-cutting and disaster. The second email they sent me was less polite. Leonard, we really need you to respond. Vendor is refusing to talk without you. Vendor wasn't refusing. Vendor was enforcing. I didn't answer that one either, because by then, I'd already decided I wasn't going to help them understand in private what they refused to acknowledge in public. That's the part no one talks about in corporate culture. The difference between savings on a spreadsheet and costs on a balance sheet. It's easy to measure what you pay, harder to measure what you prevent. I didn't set a trap. I wrote a failsafe. They cut it out without asking what it did. And now, watching my phone light up with another critical vendor access issue escalation subject line, I just set it face down on the table, because I wasn't going to teach them for free. Not anymore. If you've ever watched leadership chase short-term savings while ignoring long-term risk, you know what I'm talking about. Tell us about it. These stories matter. The real damage hadn't even begun to cascade yet. Vendor lockout was just the first tremor, because next would come the clients. And they were never as polite as the vendor. The first client didn't send a polite question. They sent a threat. Subject line in all caps. Urgent. SLA violation idiot response required. I didn't get that email, of course. I wasn't CC'd anymore. But I heard about it. People talk. Even in companies trying to keep disaster under wraps. It was the moment things changed from internal embarrassment to external liability. Internal vendor lockout you can call a bug, a glitch, a maintenance issue. But once your clients see it, it's a breach, a failure, a reason to walk. That's what Clause 4.7 was designed to stop. Not just vendor indemnity, but reputational collapse. Because when a vendor integration fails, you don't just lose access, you lose trust. And trust isn't a resource you can requisition at quarter's end. I imagined the first Slack messages. Client escalation? Who's taking point? Legal? Needs language? Now. This is turning into an SLA violation. Everyone's scrambling to pin it somewhere. Anywhere but on themselves. It wouldn't work. Because Clause 4.7 wasn't vague. It didn't leave room for interpretation. Indemnity for integration failures is contingent upon approved oversight by the named compliance authority. They fired the named authority. So vendor coverage evaporated. And clients didn't want to hear about internal reorgs. They wanted service. That was always the part they never grasped. Client don't buy systems. They buy reliability, continuity, trust. You break that, they don't wait for you to fix it. They move. I heard the vendor's first warning email had gone out within 48 hours of my termination. We are unable to confirm designated compliance authority per contractual requirement. Access will be restricted, pending resolution. It wasn't hostile. It was procedural. A line of text written like any other error message. But for our clients, it might as well have been in neon. We can't guarantee your data. I could see the boardroom in my head. The CEO demanding updates. Legal drafting disclaimers. Operations blaming IT. None of it mattered, because the clients weren't reading their internal Slack. They were reading the error messages. Integration failed. Access denied. Authorized user required. No one wants to see those words when they're managing sensitive data, and the account managers would be the first line of fire. They'd try to buy time. We're experiencing a temporary vendor issue. We're working with our integration partner on a fix. But vendor don't fix contract violation. They enforce them. That was the part no one in the C-suite ever bothered to learn. When you buy indemnity, you're buying trust. The moment you break the terms, the trust is gone. Clause 4.7 wasn't there to scare vendors. It was to protect the company from itself. From short-term thinking. But short-term thinking won. They thought they were saving a salary. They didn't see they were buying a lawsuit. Or worse, a mass exodus. Because once one client walked, the rest would notice. Ask question, audit their logs. The quiet failures would go public. Not because I said anything. Because the system itself would speak. The vendor wasn't going to lie for them. Their reputation was on the line too. I imagined the vendor's own escalation emails. Per our agreement, we cannot maintain indemnity coverage without compliance confirmation. We suggest reviewing Clause 4.7 of the executed contract. Polite. Final. I didn't need to sabotage anything. The trap wasn't buried. It was in bold text, signed by me, filed in their own legal repository. But no one read it. They just signed the severance envelope, shook my hand without meeting my eyes, and forgot to ask the only question that mattered. Who's authorized now? Silence was the answer. Now that silence was expanding, rippling out in every direction. Clients, vendors, legal, operations, everyone realizing at once that the one thing they couldn't replace wasn't my role. It was my responsibility. I never wanted this, but I also wasn't going to stop it, because you don't prevent consequences for people who refuse to believe there are any. I glanced once more at my phone screen as it lit up with another subject line. Client escalation, board-level concern. They were finally realizing the problem wasn't technical. It was structural, contractual, human, and the meltdown was just beginning. Tomorrow, they'd stop emailing me and start blaming each other. It wasn't the vendor error that killed them. It wasn't even the client threats. It was the silence in the boardroom. When someone finally asked, who signed off on firing him? That was when the meltdown turned inward. My phone kept buzzing with new headlines. Their stock had slipped 0.5% after a rumor about a regional integration disruption. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. But internally, it was chaos. I didn't have access to their Slack anymore, obviously. But people talked. Screenshots traveled. Especially the ugly ones. One I saw was simple. A message from Operations VP. Who the hell approved this separation? No one replied for a full minute. You could see the read receipts stacking up like silent accusations. Another from legal. We flagged Clause 4.7 last year. It's in the risk register. And then HR chiming in, tired and blunt. We said this wasn't a clean cut. We have the email. That last part made me pause, because I remembered that email. It was from Serena. She wasn't some corporate shark. She actually tried. I remember the day she called me to HR pre-meeting, weeks before the final cut. Voice low, eyes worried. "Leonard, they're reviewing roles for a reduction. I need to ask this vendor clause you always mention. Is it real?" I didn't sugarcoat it. "It's not just real," I told her. "It's the only thing keeping them on the hook for failures we can't afford." She bit her lip, nodded, typed it up in a note. I wasn't surprised she'd logged it. HR always logs everything. I imagine it surfaced later, buried in a separation risk assessment, with some bland subject line, "Consider risk vendor indemnity." But leadership didn't care. They had a target number to hit for the board. Headcount reduction. Legacy fat. I knew the math. Removing me was $200,000 off the books including benefits. They didn't bother to see the cost side of the ledger. But that's corporate culture. Costs are concrete. Risks are theoretical. Until they're not. I pictured Dale in that conference room, arms crossed, voice rising as he tried to shift blame. Legal should have caught this. Har should have flagged it harder. Ops shouldn't have signed the termination form without review. All of them forgetting one simple truth. They all signed it because no one wanted to be the one who said no. They wanted harmony, alignment, consensus, until it went wrong. Then they wanted a scapegoat. I wasn't there to wear that role for them. I'd already walked out, severance envelope in hand, badge in the box, access revoked, audit trail clean. Their slack arguments didn't surprise me. Why didn't anyone escalate? Serena did. She put it in writing. It's not HR's job to audit contracts. True. But they tried anyway. They flagged the risk. Legal wrote the clause. Ops signed the termination. Finance approved the severance. Everyone had a hand on the knife. But no one wanted to hold it now. I imagined them pulling old meeting notes, trying to prove they always supported integration best practices, scrambling to find emails they could wave in the board's face. Proof of innocence. Or at least, proof of shared guilt. None of it mattered. The clients didn't care. The vendor didn't care. The system didn't care. Compliance doesn't answer to Slack channels. I had warned them before, not in some dramatic showdown, but in the quiet ways that matter. Email after email with tracked changes on the vendor contract, Slack messages with dry legal references, meetings with the phrase, "This clause isn't optional." They all nodded. They all forgot, until the meltdown started. Now, I sat back in my chair, phone on silent, reading the latest headline about unexpected service disruptions impacting renewals. I didn't smile, didn't celebrate. It wasn't satisfying. It was just inevitable. Because corporate loyalty is cheap until it costs something, and accountability is an orphan when the bill comes due. I traced my finger along the edge of the severance envelope still on my shelf, a relic of that meeting in room 3A. They thought that piece of paper ended something. It didn't. It was just the moment they stopped paying for protection and started paying for exposure, because I still had my own archive of those flagged warnings. And they were about to remember exactly what I said. Memory is an unprofitable department. Most companies treat it that way. They love a clean desk policy. Delete your inbox before you go. Hand in your badge. Sign the envelope. Forget. But I kept everything, not because I wanted to hurt them, because I knew someday someone would try to rewrite the truth. And sure enough, they did. While the vendor error messages stacked up and the clients started issuing breach notices, inside their offices they were playing a different game entirely. Find the culprit. I wasn't there to watch it, but I'd seen enough to know exactly how it went. Did we know this was a risk? Who signed off on firing him? Where's the documentation? They always act surprised when the system enforces the rules they forgot they approved. I imagined them rifling through shared drives, Slack archives, Outlook folders with thousands of half-read chains. They wouldn't find what they needed there, because most of them didn't even remember reading it the first time. But I did. I had my own archive. Call it a habit. Call it self-defense. Call it professional paranoia. I called it memory. On my personal drive, there was a folder labeled simply, Vendor, Indemnity. Inside, Clause 4, 7 Draft, für 6. Final, Signet. PDF, Vendor, Policy Memo, PDF, HR, Risk, Flag Email, MSG, Legal Review Notes. DocX, ARI, Separation Risk Register. XLSX. I didn't take confidential client data, didn't steal anything, but I kept every risk memo that had my name on it, because they try to pretend they didn't know. They always do. I remember writing one of those risk assessments myself, 6 months before they decided I was redundant. Dry, unremarkable, but clear. Removing designated compliance authority without approved transition will trigger indemnity revocation per clause 4.7. Recommend mitigation plan before any staffing changes. No one replied to that email. Not a single, thanks. Not even a got it. I watched the read receipts stack up like tombstones, but I saved it anyway. Because it wasn't my job to convince them. My job was to know. To document. They used to laugh about that. Leonard the archivist. Leonard who always CC'd legal. Leonard who kept every note from vendor calls. They didn't realize that was my function. Not to make friends. To make sure someone remembered. Even if that someone was only me. When the meltdown started, they must have searched for those files. Maybe they even found the sanitized version on the shared drive. But not the real one. Not the annotated copy with my highlights and comments. Mitigation plan pending approval. High risk if ignored. I didn't write that to cover my ass. I wrote it because I'd seen companies die without it. That's the part they never understood about me. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I wasn't playing gotcha. I was trying to leave a warning. Because one day, I knew I wouldn't be there to explain it in person. That day came faster than I expected. They pushed the envelope across the HR table. Signed it without reading anything except the dollar amount. And in that moment, they traded institutional memory for short-term savings. They didn't see the value in someone who remembered the vendor's phrasing during the indemnity negotiation. Who could quote Clause 4.7 from memory? Who knew why it existed in the first place? Because risk isn't sexy. It doesn't show up on a quarterly dashboard. Until it does. Now, watching from the outside, I could picture the panic in their eyes. Did we know about this? Why wasn't this escalated? Who owns the vendor relationship now? I wasn't there to answer. They had paid me to go away. So I went. I didn't post about it online. Didn't leak anything. Didn't threaten. I just waited. Because I knew that once the client started leaving, once the vendor refused indemnity, once the SLA penalties hit, they'd look for the one thing they truly didn't have anymore. Memory. Not data. Not policy. Not a signed contract. But the understanding of what those things meant. That was what I sold them all those years. Not words. Not document. Continuity. And they fired it. So I kept my archive. Not as a weapon. As proof. Because someday, they were going to call. And when they did, I'd answer. But on my terms. Because I didn't write Clause 4.7 to punish them. I wrote it to protect them. And now they'd pay to remember why. The first real voicemail didn't even bother with pleasantries. No. Hello, Leonard. No apology. Just Dale's voice. Dry. Strained. Fighting not to crack. Leonard, we need to talk. We may have acted prematurely. Vendor is refusing indemnity without you. Let's discuss options. Options. He couldn't even say the word mistake. I played the message twice. Not because I needed to hear it again, but because I wanted to study the pauses. The silence between the words was where the truth lived. He was begging, in the most professional tone he could muster. I set the phone down, stared at it for a long time. That call had been inevitable from the day they fired me. Because Clause 4.7 wasn't an insurance policy. It was a leash. I'd written it that way on purpose. Not to punish them, but to make sure they couldn't pretend this didn't matter. Because I'd seen too many companies let compliance become an afterthought. Something you outsource. Something you delete from the org chart in a bad quarter. Then they learn the hard way that you can't outsource trust. And you can't replace institutional memory with a cheaper salary band. Clause 4.7 existed, so that when they tried, they'd be forced to ask. They didn't have to keep me, but they had to acknowledge that integration risk didn't go away with me. They refused. So the vendor refused. And now, they were leaving voicemails. I remembered drafting the line in the vendor contract. Black and white, nothing fancy. Integration indemnity is void in the event of unauthorized replacement of named compliance authority. Named. Me. There was no workaround. No acting compliance-led. No rushed delegation. They could only get indemnity back one way. By asking. And paying. Because I hadn't left it open-ended. If they wanted my signature on the vendor reauthorization form, it would be on my terms. My old severance envelope was still on the shelf. I glanced at it now. Faded edges. Crease from where Serena had pushed it across the table. They thought that was the end of our relationship. They didn't realize it was just the payment for silence. Silence wasn't help. Now they needed help. I scrolled through my own archive. Every risk memo. Every flagged clause. Every unacknowledged consider risk email. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was checking my memory, because if I was going to answer them, I needed to remember exactly why I wrote clause 4.7 that way. I didn't want to give them a favor. I wanted to give them a bill, and it wouldn't just be money. They wanted indemnity reinstated. They'd get my terms. Strict scope. No internal meetings. No strategy sessions. No brand refresh. Just compliance. One signature. One clause. One fee. And no illusions about loyalty. Because loyalty ends when they decide you're legacy fat. I thought about Dale recording that voicemail. Probably alone. Trying to hit the right note between authority and humility. Failing at both. He wasn't calling because he respected me. He was calling because he had no other choice. The vendor wouldn't talk to them. The indemnity policy wouldn't cover them. Clients were threatening breach penalties. And every solution required the one thing they no longer had. Me. I didn't laugh. Didn't gloat. But I didn't feel sorry for them either. They built this. They designed the system that didn't value memory until it was gone. Now they'd pay to rent it back. That was what clause 4.7 was for. Not revenge. Not punishment. Insurance. Insurance you couldn't fake. Couldn't delegate. Couldn't discount. And the premium had just gone up. Tomorrow, I'd call them back. And I wouldn't say yes. I'd give them my conditions. I waited an extra day before I called them back. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. Because by the time I returned Dale's message, I wanted them to be desperate enough to listen. They picked up on the first ring. His voice was smaller than I remembered. Still trying to sound corporate, measured. But I could hear the fatigue. The long nights. Leonard, thank you for returning the call. I didn't say you're welcome. Silence is an answer. He cleared his throat. I think it's fair to say. Things have escalated. I let him squirm. Clients are refusing sign-offs until the vendor indemnity is restored. The vendor has refused to discuss reinstatement without you. I waited. Finally, he exhaled. What would it take to get you back on board, even temporarily? There it was. The surrender. I kept my voice even. No emotion. I don't come back on board. Silence. Confusion. Leonard, be reasonable. I am. That's my first condition. I heard the shuffle of papers. Maybe legal was in the room with him. Maybe HR. What does that mean exactly? It means I don't return as an employee. I don't attend meetings. I don't answer Slack. I don't sit in your org chart. I waited for that to land. Consulting only, I said finally. Flat fee. No equity. No brand alignment. No strategy sessions. Scope. Single purpose. I review the indemnity conditions. I sign the vendor reauthorization. I instruct your legal on the exact compliance phrase to restore coverage. Nothing else. Silence. That seems restrictive. That's the point. I could hear the panic behind his calm. They wanted me back, but not like this. They wanted the memory, the trust, the signature, but they wanted it on their terms. Cheap, silent, controllable. I wasn't giving them that. I laid out the rest, one line at a time. I set the fee. No negotiation. I set the timeline. They wouldn't rush me for a board presentation. I delivered directly to your vendor and legal. No internal handover calls. No slide decks. Leonard, can we be realistic about the urgency here? You should have been realistic before you fired the compliance authority who negotiated the clause. That shut him up. I didn't gloat. I read the final condition carefully. And clause 4, doesn't get amended. He tried. We might need flexibility in future integrations. Number. Dead stop. That clause stays intact. It doesn't get rewritten. Not while my name is on the reauthorization. More shuffling. A muffled voice in the background. Legal advising. I waited. Because the truth was, they didn't have options. Vendor policy wouldn't budge without my signature. Clients wouldn't budge without vendor indemnity. And clause 4.7 was the lock that only fit one key. Mine. Finally. Dale spoke again. Low. Resigned. Send over your terms. I already have, I said. I heard his breath catch. Because of course I had. It had gone out that morning. Consulting agreement in PDF. Scope. Fee. Timeline. Non-disclosure. Non-employee classification. All signed on my side, waiting for theirs, because I didn't need their permission. I was offering them containment, not partnership. Protection. For a price. A fair price. Considering the alternative, he didn't thank me. He didn't apologize, but he signed, because that's the thing about leverage. It doesn't require mutual respect, just mutual recognition of reality. I ended the call without another word, set the phone down, watched the cursor blink on the email notification as their counter-signature arrived. Clause 4.7 stayed intact. My conditions, my timeline, my rate, because this wasn't revenge. It was insurance. Insurance with teeth. I didn't write Clause 4.7 to punish them. I wrote it so they'd never forget the price of pretending compliance was optional. And once the deal was signed, I sat back and let them realize just how expensive forgetting had become. The final vendor email was a single line. Indemnity coverage reinstated. Per clause 4,7 authorization. No fanfare. No apology. No congratulations. Just a switch being flipped back on. That was always the point. I closed the email. Saturday for a minute in the quiet, listening to the hum of my office heater. I could imagine their office at that same moment. Phones ringing. Slack threads buzzing with relief. Legal confirming to the board that coverage was restored. Dale probably sent a one-line announcement to leadership. Vendor compliance confirmed. Like it was inevitable. Like it had just worked out. They wouldn't mention the call they made to me. The consulting contract they signed under duress. The check they cut at twice my old rate. They'd bury all that. Pretend it never happened. I didn't blame them. Corporations have short memories by design. But I didn't. On the shelf next to me was the old severance envelope, still creased at the corner, a reminder of the day they told me I was no longer required. Next to it was the signed consulting agreement. My terms. Their signatures. Clause 4,7 unchanged. Intact. Because even after all this, I refused to let them weaken it. I wrote that clause years ago, not because I didn't trust vendors, not because I didn't trust clients, but because I didn't trust us. I'd seen the meetings where risk was waved away as hypothetical, where the loudest voice won because no one wanted to be the wet blanket, where budgets got slashed, and compliance was the first thing cut. I wrote Clause 4.7 as a failsafe, so that even if they fired me, even if they forgot why I mattered, even if they gutted the department, the system would stop them, force them to ask. That wasn't malice. It was protection. I never wanted them ruined, never wanted clients to leave, vendors to Escalating. I wanted them to remember that contracts mean something, that trust can't be assigned to whoever's cheapest this quarter, that some knowledge doesn't live on a server, it lives in people. I didn't want their failure. I wanted their humility. And in that one desperate call back, I finally got it. They didn't say sorry. They said, "We need you." That was enough. Enough to prove the system worked. Even if I didn't work there anymore, they'd pay the invoice. They'd get vendor coverage restored. Clients would calm down. For now. But they'd never really replace me. Because no one else would want the job knowing exactly how it ended last time. Legacy fat. I picked up the Clause 4.7 printout one last time. Traced my name at the bottom. The signature they couldn't fake. That was the price of forgetting. And for once, they paid it in full. I wasn't angry, just tired. Because that's the part no one understands about people like me. We don't write these policies to trap our colleagues. We write them to save them from themselves. And sometimes that means letting them fail. Letting them feel the full cost of ignoring the one thing they thought they could replace. Memory. I didn't burn bridges. I just made sure they couldn't cross them without me. They'll talk about me in meetings. Not fondly. Not like a team member. More like a condition. A name and a clause. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all I was ever meant to be there. If you've ever been told you're replaceable, only to watch them realize you weren't, tell your story. Because some of us were never just line items. We were the clause they forgot to read. I didn't set a trap. I wrote a failsafe. And I hope the next person they try to cut remembers that before signing anything at all.